Hello and welcome to today's NCA webinar titled Coronavirus Town Hall for Clubs. Before I throw the floor over to Henry Wallmeyer, we do have a polling question for everyone. It should appear on your screen at this time. And the question is, what moderations have you made to your club and its programming in regards to the coronavirus? And you do have several answers here, and we'll give you a few minutes here to answer. And while I see those answers coming in, I would, to begin today's presentation, I would like to throw the floor to Henry Wallmeyer, President and CEO of the National Club Association. Henry, when you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Outstanding, Billy. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Coronavirus Town Hall for Clubs. We're excited that we have so many of you participating in this. There's more than 1,500 of you who are participating in this, and that's just a tremendous number. It goes to show the thirst for knowledge that is out there amongst the club community about what clubs should be doing during this pandemic. And so we're happy to be able to provide this webinar for you. And we put together a tremendous panel of experts who are going to be able to provide you information that are going to be able to help you make the best decisions for your club. I'll come back on at the end with some other additional information and some follow-up that we'll be doing. But as Billy mentioned, a recording of this webinar and the slides will be sent out to all registered participants within 1 to 2 days following this, as well as other information that we have for you. So please feel free to submit questions. Like he said, the more that we can learn from the clubs out there, the better that we can be at providing pertinent information to you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Trauger, the National Club Association's Vice President of Government Relations, who's going to moderate this webinar. Take it away, Joe.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. And we've got a tremendous amount of material to get through here, and we want to make sure that we leave as much time as possible for questions and answers. I think that that's probably going to be some of the most productive time for us to be able to respond to specific questions that you all have. I do have a number of questions that we'll get to right away that were kind of, in a survey that was done over the last 24, 48 hours, seem to be the most, significant questions or the most asked questions. So by way of introduction, as Henry said, my name is Joe Trauger. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations here at the National Club Association, and I've worked up on the Hill for about 10 years, and probably more importantly, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, I've been on the board of Mount Vernon Country Club for 6 years, and I'm currently serving as president in my second year as president of Mount Vernon Country Club. So this is very much something that is of importance to me. I consider myself a stakeholder like all of you. So this is a really important time and kind of uncharted territory that we're in. So what I wanted to do was go through real quickly. Thank you very much. So as you all are aware, there's been 2 pieces of legislation that have passed in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The most recent is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That was passed, it says Friday, March 13th, but it was actually the Friday session that went into early Saturday morning. The bill was voted on at about 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. And this was as a result of some intense negotiations that were undertaken by Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Secretary of Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin. House members were given about 15 minutes to view the legislation prior to its vote at 1 o'clock in the morning. This led to some errors that weren't caught in time. So where we're at in terms of the process is the House is going to have to repass this legislation, and then they'll send it on to the Senate. The House is hoping to pass it by unanimous consent later today or possibly tomorrow, but we're keeping an eye on that to make sure that happens. I mentioned an error in the legislation. I'll get to that a bit later, but just want a quick run through of the provisions of the bill. There's nutrition assistance or food assistance that's in the bill for supplemental nutrition assistance programs or SNAP for kids who are not in school. $500 million is made available for the Women, Infants, and Children program, or the WIC program. $400 million is made available for the Commodity Assistance Program, which is a food assistance program for low income, and $100 million is made available to the Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the American Samoa. So that's the food assistance side. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time on those because they are not necessarily of impact to clubs. So looking at the provisions that are most likely to impact clubs, the coronavirus testing is made cost-free for the uninsured, and insurance companies are required to provide the test and related services such as office visits and those kinds of things and follow-ups with no co-payment, and no prior authorization is required if you're in a managed care plan. In addition, coronavirus emergency leave is provided in the bill for employees of businesses with fewer than 500 workers. Employers would have to provide as many as 12 weeks of job-protected family and medical leave for employees who have to do a number of one of three things: either comply with a requirement or recommendation to quarantine because of exposure or symptoms of the virus, provide care to a family member who's complying with such a requirement or a recommendation, or provide child care for a child younger than 18 whose school or daycare is closed due to the virus. The first 14 days of that leave can be unpaid, though a worker could choose to use accrued vacation days, personal leave, sick days, or other paid time off that they may have available. Following the 14-day period, workers would receive a benefit from their employers that would be at least 2/3 of their normal pay rate. The Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, is also amended so employees could use unpaid leave if they are diagnosed with the virus, caring for a family member or child due to closures. The Department of Labor, with respect to the Family Medical Leave Act, is authorized to issue regulations that would exempt small businesses with fewer than 50 employees and exclude certain healthcare providers and emergency responders from paid leave benefits. Another provision within the bill is emergency sick leave. Emergency sick leave for employees of businesses with fewer than 500 employees would allot up to 80 hours for full-time employees. And for the part-time workers, it would be the equivalent of the normal number of hours that part-time employee would have worked over a two-week period. This sick leave would be made available for those who self-quarantine, obtain a medical diagnosis or care for coronavirus, or to provide for a family member who has been diagnosed or is in quarantine, or for a child whose school or daycare is closed due to the coronavirus. Employers that have similar existing paid leave policies would be required to provide workers with the emergency paid sick time and cannot require a worker to use any other available paid leave before using the sick time. Employers would be prohibited from requiring a worker to find a replacement to cover their hours during their time off. And the employers would also be prohibited from discharging or discriminating against workers for requesting paid sick leave or filing a complaint against the employer. This is the provision, this emergency sick leave provision is the one that had the significant error, and it has to do with the cap on the income that is replaced, which was set at $511 per day up to for individuals to care for themselves, or $200 a day to care for a family member or child. Don't want to get into too much of the details, but it was just a drafting error that didn't actually do what they intended to do, and this again was the result of parties that were drafting the legislation, and it was a limited number of folks that were in that room. And almost immediately after they released the language, the minority leader's office, their staff actually recognized it and identified that problem. So that's what's kind of causing the issue, and that'll require them to repass the legislation. I did have a conversation with Kevin McCarthy's chief of staff yesterday. Kevin McCarthy is the minority leader of the House, the Republican leader, and who identified the error. And going forward, I think there's a much better understanding or willingness to make sure that there are more people in the room to be able to negotiate the language and make sure that it's actually doing what the principals want it to do. So I look forward to seeing some better cooperation and expertise in the room as things go forward on pieces of legislation. Just to put a cap on the employer side of things, in terms of those benefits, an employer could be subject to civil penalties for violation of paid sick leave requirements. So this is something that we'll need to keep an eye on and make sure that is followed. Another aspect of the legislation that is important for folks to understand is that there are employer tax credits contained in the legislation that would help employers be able to fund the paid sick leave that the government is requiring. So the legislation provides payroll tax credits to employers to cover the wages to employees that are taking time off under the bill's sick leave and family leave programs. This credit is refundable. Again, this is on the payroll side. So this is the funds that are set aside per employee to pay for Social Security benefits, so old age survivors and disability insurance. That's the 6.2% that employers pay. So the bill would allow employers to take a credit based upon the earnings that they would pay normally for that employee against their Social Security contributions. The credit is refundable if it exceeds the amount the employer owed in payroll taxes. And this would be in effect for wages through the end of this year. So December 31st, 2020, at least at this point, would be the cutoff point for that. And when it comes to all of this stuff, the legislation actually goes into effect in 15 days after passage, and there are going to have to be regulations and guidance that's going to be issued by various departments in order to implement the legislation. So some of the mechanics we may not actually see for a little while. I have no doubt that the Department of Treasury is working on those as we speak, and we'll be working with them and staying in touch with them to make sure that we're on top of that and can provide that information as soon as we possibly can. So that's the Families First Act or Coronavirus Response Act, and it's pretty widely accepted that there's going to be additional actions taken by the federal government. As I mentioned, there have been 2 coronavirus-related bills so far. The first one was $8 billion for the Health and Human Services Department to bolster their response efforts. And again, this Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which we just went over. Congress and administration officials have agreed that there will be at least one more package, and that will really get at some of the economic impacts of the closures and the social distancing and those kinds of things that have had on the economy. It is pretty widely accepted that this legislation would include things like airlines, cruise lines, small businesses, the hospitality industry. And one of the outstanding questions that we have in terms of how it could potentially impact clubs is how does it affect associations and nonprofit entities? And are they going to be eligible for the economic aid that might be coming down in the coming weeks? The NCA did send a letter on Friday to the Speaker, the Minority Leader in the House, and the Majority Leader and Minority Leader in the Senate, urging them to make sure that any further economic assistance is available to associations and nonprofit entities. We are not the only voice on that matter. There are a number of associations and other groups that have made a similar request. So I'm confident that we are in a large and growing company of folks who are interested in making sure that that is available. In addition, and this isn't on the slide, but last Friday, you all are probably aware, the President declared a national emergency, and that opens up additional resources for businesses, and in particular small businesses. The Small Business Administration is authorized to issue as much as $50 billion in low-interest loans for small businesses. And just for your awareness, you can apply for disaster assistance for economic injury on the SBA website under the Funding Programs tab, and you'll see a box for disaster assistance when you enter that page. You click into that, and then you'll see a big picture of the coronavirus, and you click into that, and you'll see economic injury disaster loans. They can offer up to $2 million in assistance. The loans will can be used to pay fixed debts, payroll, accounts payable, and other bills that can't be paid because of the disaster's impact. The interest rate for small businesses is 3.75%, and for nonprofit entities, the interest rate is 2.75%. The terms of these loans are determined on a case-by-case basis, but they can go as far out as a maximum of 30 years. In addition to the measures that have been taken, these types of things, you probably also are aware that the Federal Reserve has dropped its overnight rate down to 0%, and that's the funding that banks use to help conduct their business, so we could see some additional quantitative easing and other actions by the Federal Reserve to respond to the downturn in the economy. The market is down today. It was down as much as 11% earlier today, but right now it's holding at about minus 1,500 points, or about 6.5%. In addition, and I think the Dr. Catherine Troisi will talk about some of this, and we'll get to her shortly. But testing is also going to be made more available here starting today, and we are going to see the numbers of diagnosed cases of coronavirus COVID-19 really kind of spike, I think, in the next week or two. So that's going to have some additional impact on what the federal government does and how it responds. So I've gone a little bit longer than I intended, but I just want to conclude by letting you all know that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a stakeholder in all of this. I'm a member of 2 clubs, and as I mentioned, the president of Mount Vernon Country Club here in Alexandria, Virginia. And one important point, at least from that perspective, that I'd like to make sure folks understand is, obviously we're in uncharted waters here. And it's critical from a club management perspective and a membership management perspective to err on the side of over-communicating with your staff and with your members. My general manager, Pete Van Pelt, and I have been in constant contact over the course of the last couple of weeks, and adjusting, modifying our approach to the things that we're doing, and we continue to make adjustments. For example, of over-communicating, I've sent 3 blast emails to the membership, updating them on actions that we've taken. And my board has met via teleconference once in the last few days. We have another meeting scheduled tomorrow. And for us, all of the club's social activities have been suspended, at least for the next 2 weeks, and we're going to have that on sort of a rolling basis. So as we get further along in this process, we'll be looking at 2-week intervals for those decisions. And other things that we've done, we have hand sanitizer locations all over the club, and members and staff are using them heavily. Golf, for now, is remaining open, and we'll be assembling a group of medical professionals within our membership to make sure that we have some medical, clinical background to make recommendations and advise the board moving forward. So with that concludes my sort of presentation. And what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Dr. Troisi. She is a PhD infectious disease epidemiologist with the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. I know that she's been doing a number of these type of webinars and conference calls to go over where we are from a clinical standpoint. So, Dr. Troisi, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Let me bring up my slides. And I just want to say, for those of you who are listening to this later on, you know, as everybody knows, the situation is changing rapidly. So this is, excuse me, this is where we are basically as of last night when I put these slides together. So what we know is this is a new virus, a coronavirus. We have not seen it in humans before. It's very similar to a virus found in bats. We know it can be transmitted easily from person to person. It looks like flu, which makes it hard because we're not able to test as much as we want in the United States. And although some people seem to present, excuse me, with GI symptoms. And here in Houston, we're in the middle of allergy season, which is also complicating the issue. We know that those who are older, and that is over 60, sorry to say, those who are morbidly obese, i.e. very obese, and those who have comorbid conditions, heart disease, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, immunosuppression, are at higher risk of dying. We know that China bought us some time to prepare. Unfortunately, we didn't use it wisely. And with a virus like this, it's just really impossible to contain it. So that we're going to need a different approach than we used with SARS. And we also know that we have cut back public health funding over the last lots of years. You know, that has not helped the situation, and we will see spillover like this again. So the person-to-person spread is through droplets, which is when you cough. Even when we talk or sing, there are small droplets of saliva coming out of our mouth, through personal contact and through fomites, which are environmental services, doorknobs, handrails, things like that. There's some indication now that it also may be spread by aerosol, and these are tinier droplets in the air. That is important because whereas droplets are heavier and fall to the ground, so if you're more than 6 feet from somebody, they can't infect you. Those droplets just don't stick around in the air, and as I said, they don't go more than 3 to 6 feet. Aerosol, on the other hand, are very light, and they can stay around and for up to maybe 2 hours in the air. So you don't have to even be near somebody to get infected. Now, we know that's the case with measles. There's some indication that might be the case here, but we don't know for sure. We know that it takes between 1 and 14 days after you've been exposed to someone with the infection for you to come down with the symptoms if you are going to get sick. The mean is around 5 to 7 days. It's more infectious than SARS was, but fewer people die, so that's good. We know that people can shed virus, and that means infect others early in the infection. There's some indication that even before you have symptoms, you can shed virus. This is really important for transmission as well. You know, we tell people to stay home once they're sick, and hopefully people are doing that. But if you're not sick yet and can still transmit the virus, that has a lot of implications for community spread. As I said, we see higher rates of death in the elderly. men, for at least in China, had a higher rate of death, but it may have been due to higher smoking rates among men versus women in China. Luckily, we are not seeing deaths in children. We're not even seeing a lot of infection, or it's very, very mild. And we don't know why that's the case. It's going to be a really interesting thing to study. Overall, about 14 to 20% of infections are severe, that is, requiring medical care, and about 2% of those die. The range is between 0.5% and 3.5%. That may not sound like, but as I said, it's higher in those higher risk groups. It may not sound like a whole lot, but if everybody in the United States is getting infected, or a high percentage are, then that's a whole lot of people. What are people infectious before they have symptoms? And if so, how long before they have symptoms? Some people seem to have no symptoms at all and yet are still shedding the virus. Children, for example. So what role do they play in transmission? And then there are 1 or 2 studies so far that show some people are shedding virus after they have resolved their symptoms. And again, all of these have a lot of implications for community spread. We don't know when a person is most infectious, also important to know. And as I said, we don't know how long the virus can remain in the environment. There are reports that on certain surfaces it can last for 2 to 3 days. That's in a laboratory situation, not out in the environment. A report was just published about that the virus can linger in air, that aerosol transmission. But again, these are preliminary results, and I don't want to say that that's for sure. One of the things we all would really like to know is, will the virus disappear when warmer weather occurs? And other respiratory viruses do, but this is a new one we haven't seen before. And even if it does disappear, will it come back in the fall as temperatures get cooler? So right now, or as of last night, there were over 163,000 confirmed infections, whereas at first all of those infections were in China. Now half of them are outside, mainly in China. Extra zero in there, sorry, over 6,000 deaths. We're seeing cases reported in 146 out of about 190 countries in the world. And I would hazard a guess that many of the countries that have not reported are not testing, don't have the capability to test. It has been deemed a pandemic. It's also an infodemic in that there are a lot of misinformation out there. And I would encourage everybody to go to trusted sources. The CDC, your local health department, your state health department. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there. And then a fear-demic, that there's a lot of fear. Human psychology tells us we don't like unknowns, and this is an unknown. And we are very concerned over that rapid increase that we're seeing in Iran and then Italy and other parts of Europe. The U.S. situation, there are over 3,000 cases. We're seeing a rapid increase despite the fact that we do not have the ability to test as much as we want. And as Joe said, we are going to see a rapid increase in that numbers once testing becomes more widespread, which we hope will happen soon, but that's an hour talk by itself about the testing issues. While we are seeing increased community spread, we're also just going to see more detection of cases that were already there. As of last night, there were 62 deaths in the United States. I think it's up to 65 as of this morning. We've seen cases in 49 states, plus D.C., Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And let me just say that the federal response to this has not been optimal. So what everybody wants to know what's going to happen, right? Well, we don't know. That's the bottom line. we have not contained the virus. That is keeping it to a small area. And we are moving into community mitigation. And that's why we're seeing this call for what we call social distancing, but is really physical distancing. The big question, so we're going to have a lot of cases, no question about that. The big question is it going to be mild, moderate, or severe? In one sense, the fact that the virus does not make people as sick as, for example, SARS, is bad in that people may not confine themselves, as I said, and so it leads to increased transmission of the virus. We are going to need international cooperation to look at this virus and to help contain it worldwide. And as I talked about, social and physical distancing. So are we prepared? The answer is no. We do not have enough personal protective equipment, PPE. We're in the middle of flu season, so beds, ICU beds are full anyways. We don't have enough ventilators and other equipment. And there is tremendous concern about overwhelming the hospital system, as we are seeing in Italy right now. We're also concerned about infections that would take healthcare workers, public safety workers, teachers, although maybe that doesn't matter if schools are closed, et cetera, out of the workforce. As Joe mentioned, $8.3 billion in emergency funding was signed at the beginning of the month to help with various aspects of the response. And, health departments, I used to work at a health department, they are working 24/7, they are understaffed, and you can't do that for months at a time. There's simply burnout of people. And so that is going to be an issue as we go forward. So how bad will it get? Well, it really depends on these 6 items. One is, how contagious is the virus? The answer is pretty contagious, and I think we may find, I'm making a prediction here, that it's more contagious than we thought at the beginning. I personally, this is just my opinion, based on what I'm seeing, I think we're going to see aerosol transmission occurs, and that means it's very infectious. How deadly is the virus? Well, as I said, it's about 2% mortality. That is, 2 out of every 100 people who get the disease die. It depends on your healthcare system, of course. In parts of the world that do not have an advanced healthcare system, we're going to see higher. And then there are those high-risk groups. And if you look in the United States, 40% of Americans have a comorbid condition. That is diabetes, high blood pressure, one of those things. So a lot of us are at risk. Are people infectious before they have symptoms, or those asymptomatic cases where they don't have any symptoms? It's beginning to look like, yes, they are. And that will increase transmission as well. How much have infected persons traveled? Well, a lot. And in fact, in Wuhan, before the airports were shut down, an average of 3,500 people every day left Wuhan to travel to other parts of the world. It's a major transportation hub. So you can see the potential there for worldwide spread, as indeed we have seen. How effective is our response? Well, I would give us a D maybe up till now for a lot of reasons. Hopefully we will get better. And then how long to develop a vaccine? It's going to be at least a year to 18 months under best case scenarios. And then I have to remind you all that we have an effective vaccine for flu, and yet only 50% of the country, it's recommended for everybody over 6 months of age, gets the flu vaccine. So a vaccine is not going to be a panacea. It is not going to solve all of our problems with this virus. So scientists are working on this vaccine. There are clinical trials going on right now to look at antivirals for those who are already infected. And we're also looking at new tests, laboratory tests, because right now we can only test if you currently have the virus. We can't test if you had the virus and recovered, and that's going to be important for epidemiologic studies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You'll have the slides. I mean, we hear this all the time, what to do, how to stay healthier. It is important to note that by social distancing and keeping yourself healthy, you are not just protecting yourself. You are protecting those vulnerable populations, of which I am one. I am over 60. So the community has to respond. Just because you're 20 and don't have any other conditions and you feel you're invulnerable, by catching the disease, you may still spread it to your grandmother or grandfather or somebody else in the community who is more at risk. And then my last slide, again, is more information. And I have to put in a plug that public health is on the ballot in November. And I think we're seeing what not investing in our public health system has led to. It's important to be prepared, and you can go to ready.gov/kit to find out what you should have on hand for this social distancing, physical distancing that we have, the era we have entered. So that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end when everyone's gone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Troisi. Very informative, and we will get to those questions and answers at the end. So moving on in the program, I'd like to introduce Alan Achatz, who is the president of Club Safety Solutions, whose primary mission is bringing safety and occupational safety and health knowledge to businesses. So with that, Mr. Achatz, take it away.
Thank you very much, Joe. And thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. Kathy, thank you for raising my awareness. What can be said is communication and education are the big parts of everything and what we're going to have to do. So in order to get into this and get deeper in it, it's dialogue, but make sure that you're using online resources. Kathy said there's a lot of disinformation, and the answer is yes, there is. So what are your plans? What are your contingencies? What are your standard operating procedures? Well, if you don't have something, it's time to start doing something. And I look at this, and being a safety person, I'll always say one death is one too many. But where are we going with all this? Well, first we have to look at the hygiene, okay? If someone's ill, stay away from the club. That's what you're going to have to start with it. And then sanitize everything, wipe it on down. What's an effective sanitizer? EPA has a listing of sanitizers that they approve of. Most of them are ammonia quaternaries, but bleach does a good job. However, that takes you into personal protective equipment. But what are you wiping down? Your doors, your chairs. You have to look at your chairs, the arm of the chair, the front of the chair when you pull it in. What about the tables, okay? Hard tabletops have to be done. Your bathrooms, your faucets, your handles, your stalls, every place that someone can touch. Your hard surfaces, is being mentioned. If it's going to be aerosol and someone sneezes and it's all over everything, you're going to constantly have to be wiping things down and taking it from there. And then what about shared computers? What about the staff's computer screens and everything else? And then phones in the club if they're doing takeout orders. Then look at by department. What can happen, okay? What do you have to do in the kitchen to wipe it down? What about the food service areas? The biggest thing I'm seeing and hearing from clubs is buffets are basically shut down unless an employee is actually using all the utensils. And that means a lot when it comes to, Easter time's right around the corner for the next big event. What are we doing around the country? I saw yesterday that Illinois and Ohio have told bars and restaurants to shut down. New York City's cut in the cover counts in half of what you're allowed to bring in for business. What's going on in your locker rooms? Should you shut down your steam room? I'm going to say I would not go in a steam room personally, just for the simple reason, if it's aerosolized, it's in there. What about the sauna? Well, if you're putting water in the sauna over the rocks, is the potential that it can grow in there. I'm not an expert on this. I don't know. I'm just asking questions. Some fitness, as I have it here, some clubs have shut down their fitness facilities. Other clubs have communicated to the members and staff to use it to constantly be wiping down before you use it and after you use it. Golf, what's happening in golf? Some clubs have shut down the golf course. Others are going one golf cart per user, so no one is sharing the steering wheel. Others are wiping down and sanitizing the steering wheels. Others say you can go in the bag room, get your bag out, but please don't bring it back. And then what's being done in your offices? What are you doing? Are you able to allow your staff members to remote in? It starts a lot of questions. More often than not, I can't tell you what to do on that. What's your emergency action plan? What do you have? Do you have an infection disease preparedness and response plan? Have you looked at putting COVID plans? Have you had norovirus? I mean, there's clubs that have had norovirus outbreaks. They already know how to sanitize the club. So if you have a norovirus plan, you can roll that in. And employee options, again, employees need to make money, okay? They want to come into the club, but again, if you're ill, you have to tell them to stay away, self-quarantine. And then I put in here to know the best hospitals in your area and their ICU capacities. So if you're going to be able to get in, what do you have? The last slide that I have is simply telling you about the resources that are out there and use these, okay? Their NCA has something, a Coronavirus Club Managers Association as well. And then there's the Center for Disease Control. OSHA has a new publication out on dealing with the COVID virus. And then there's the World Health. So I know I went quickly through it, but you have a lot more great people up and coming. So, Joe, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And we will move things right along. Next up in queue is Frank Vane, who is the president of the McMahon Group, which you all are aware provides consulting and planning services to private clubs throughout North America and Asia. Frank?
Yeah, Joe, good morning, everyone. Thank you, and thanks for those comments leading into this. Certainly, the doctor's comments on the infodemic as part of this was certainly interesting. That the challenges we face in getting the right information and having that and responding accordingly is certainly a challenge that we're seeing with this. So one of the great challenges with this that certainly in my experience when we've been in very difficult times, the 9/11, for example, and even after the financial collapse, the role our clubs could play as a safe zone was very important and a real positive for us. And so certainly, we want to, likely continue that and be that place. And many clubs have great reputations and have earned confidence from their members at times of more simple challenges of power outages and storms and all of that. Our clubs have become a place of refuge. A little harder to perform that role in this environment, and we certainly can't fault those, looks like about 17% or so of clubs that have decided to close at this point. I suspect there's some regionality to that. Living here in Missouri, there are 5 cases in our state, and it seems as if it's not, certainly not yet a major issue for us. So there's going to be a response based upon where you're located. Certainly, think that you'd like to maintain that notion of a safe zone and leverage that opportunity and provide those outlets and such to our members at this time when they really need us the most. But we certainly have to be careful. As I say here, it starts with following all CDC, state, and local guidelines. as I say, while we're in Missouri and it's not seemingly a big deal for us yet, we're right across the river from Illinois, where bars and restaurants and clubs have been ordered to shut down as part of this food service operation. So you obviously need to make your plans in response to what the governmental authorities are telling us and be effective in that regard. Clearly, priority is the health and well-being of the members and employees, and I think in this case, I think most of us are aware our members are kind of taking care of themselves and doing all of that. The challenge for most of us as club leaders, club operators, is the staff, who's in much more vulnerable position as part of this, as hourly workers trying to come to work when maybe they shouldn't, and all of those things are going to play a role. And so I think as operators, we really need to focus in on that side of the equation. Clearly connecting with and communicating with our members will be important, but our members have a lot more resources and a lot more access to information and quarantine opportunities and everything else, the living conditions that are much more conducive to safety for them than maybe our more vulnerable staff positions. So I think really as a club leader, it begins by looking at your staff, communicating with them, making sure they know the protocols all the way through. Many of you are, taking temperatures before shifts and things like that, and I think that's really the place that our focus needs to be at this time. The situation, as we're saying here, is very fluid. Stay tuned and stay agile as you do that, as you say, we want to protect that reputation, protect the safety of everybody involved. Clearly, most of you have had, certainly to this point, meetings with your board and your legal counsel to understand where you are, what exposure you have, and what your leadership is comfortable with. They will, of course, have access to a lot of information themselves. They have practices they're adopting in their own businesses, and again, based upon the location for, unfortunately, clubs in Seattle or San Francisco or New York City are going to maybe have different responses and different approaches than, clubs in Missouri or West Virginia or other places that are not having so much of a challenge at this point in time. So the board should get together and I think confer fairly regularly throughout this process. Most of us to this point have communicated the initial approach to all stakeholders. I don't know that we're abreast yet on keeping everybody updated as regularly as we should. Like a lot of communications, more isn't always better. So you don't want to overwhelm people, and everybody are getting a lot of information at this point in time, but you certainly want to take steps to maintain contact with your stakeholders, keep everybody apprised of what you are doing. And I would think every day or two you'd want to be back in touch with the membership with any updates or changes that have in the situation. Certainly on staff that can work from home, you're going to want to, encourage them to do that. And then on the other side, staff that can't be there, as I say, that's really the front line, that have to be there, that can't work from home. Really the education, the monitoring, and the relentless observation of that staff and practices that Alan and others have mentioned, from the sanitizers to hand washing to all those basics, reinforced at literally hourly as you go through that. For the longer term, clubs are, evaluate those policies. Obviously, many of us now facing, gathering limits of whether it's 50 people or a couple hundred people. Your cancellation policies and reschedule fees, you're going to have to talk about those with your board. Again, in best practice, you want to, err to the side of obviously protecting the club, but you want to maintain that business, that relationship, and be thoughtful in doing that. Probably a good time to suspend things like minimum charges, and even if you're maintaining operations, what it looks like, most of us are, about 75% of clubs are maintaining operations with some modifications to that. But I think in this environment, there's no sense in incentivizing or requiring people to come and use the club. Make it a safe place that they can come, but I think, take down these kinds of provisions. And then boards are going to have to talk and look hard at, providing compensation for lost work without loss of sick time or vacation with their staff. Obviously, each club's going to have to evaluate their resources. As Joe talked about, we may have some options coming our way with, governmental assistance in that regard. But we want to, comfort our staff and again, be a safe place for them and certainly trying to maintain those relationships. And, if possible, if we're losing time and losing hours there, it may be a time that you could redirect staff to other departments or other projects during downtime. So folks that maybe, a part of the operation of food and beverage is slowed down, can we have those people doing some other chores for us? Certainly helping with all the cleaning and sanitizing and everything else would be a basic of that, but maybe there are some special projects you wanted to get to, and this would be a good time to direct staff in that regard, keeping workflow going and be ready for what's hopefully the month or two that we'll get through this and be ready to go on the other side. And again, I say this, you can certainly not fault any club, I think, choosing to close. Again, in certain areas you may not have a choice but to do that. But I think it's advisable if we can maintain operations and say if and where you can, but prioritize those operations, right? Certainly, again, on the front line with the staff, increased employee training on cleaning and hygiene protocols that are part of that, intensified and more frequent cleaning of all high-touch surfaces, hourly hand washing, use of gloves by servers and everyone in that regard. I think we'll, want to maintain, golf and other, as I say, your safer activities. I see some clubs out there, they're playing platform tennis, for example, but they've closed the paddle hut as part of that. And so, thinking about that way, that keeps that operation going, but also makes it a safer operation. Same thing with golf, whether that's one player per cart, and then certainly sanitizing the carts and steering wheels and all of those kinds of things as they are returned is certainly a big piece of it. But that would be a way that if we can navigate those waters carefully. Most of us are eliminating the large gathering, eliminating buffets. I think the obvious there, responding to both community guidance and common sense there in social distancing, fewer people in larger events and fewer people at a time is certainly part of it. We're trying to maintain some of those recreational activities that make sense. Fitness is on the other side of that. I think I'd close fitness entirely. Certainly nothing like group classes would be an obvious one, but our members and any fitness center folks are only so good at cleaning their equipment and everything else as you're into that. So that may be something that we'd want to curtail, and as I say, prioritize that for keeping things like golf and racket sports and some of those activities going as part of that. Finally, the most complex there is your food service operation. And say here really, if we're continuing that, simplify or limit. Again, a way to maintain contact with our members, not necessarily a normal NCA recommendation, but takeaway foods and those sorts of things are a way to provide a service to our members and maintain that connection. Other ways to limit our food service, either by hours of operation or scope of operations for the menu and therefore the number of staff that would be involved, using some prepared foods and ways to provide that, things that can be much more tightly controlled, would be a good practice at this time. I know a number of clubs have removed seats from the dining room to create some more space in those areas, serve a fewer number of people at a time. Those are all wise practices to get folks, 6 feet or more away from each other in general, that don't know each other. And again, this is advisable only in those lower risk areas. Higher risk areas, you'd probably go all the way with the shutdown of that. group events are certainly canceled as part of this. And then finally, think long term in this. We get immediate, and as I say, our bias is to try and think about how we can maintain a connection, a service, and be a place of refuge for our members at this time. At the same time, we need to think long term, and certainly protecting that safe space status for our employees and for our members long term is your priority. Is your real priority there. So, if you are operating, you've got to be extremely vigilant to not have an outbreak or an issue at the club. If you are in doubt, err to the side of caution. If we can't do this well, too complex, our facilities are not geared for it, our staff, challenges are there, then, as I say, certainly, shutting down and further curtailment makes sense. And, hopefully there is not a problem, but if a club that has an event, you've got to immediately fix it at all cost. Closure, sanitation, and vigilant steps over shooting in that regard to rebound from anything that happens there. So, I hope these comments are helpful to you in this challenging and unusual time, where our clubs are trying to be, as they always are, a third place for our members, that home away from home. We have to balance who's in our home, limiting guests, limiting access, all that makes sense at these times. Protect your reputation and your staff and your members for the longer term, and hopefully in a couple of months we're on the other side of this. Thank you for the time today, Joe. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Frank. Very, very important things to consider. And moving on our speaking order, I want to turn it over to Ray Cronin, who is the founder and chief innovator with Club Benchmarking, and is familiar to many or most of you. So he's going to talk about some of the club finance aspects of this. So take it away, Ray.
Okay. Hopefully I can pull up these slides real quickly. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, so I guess thanks, Frank. Thanks, everyone. My section of this town hall is related to the financial effect. The way I look at it at the moment, and it's kind of funny, we did a webinar a couple of weeks ago that couldn't have seen it coming quite like this. In my own head, I break it into three buckets. I'll call it the short term, the mid-term, and then the long term. The short term, I would suggest, is through the end of April. I live in Massachusetts. All bars and restaurants are prohibited from on-premises consumption. They can do takeout through the end of April. Interestingly, when the governor made that mention yesterday on a news conference, he also specifically said private clubs as well. So, to my knowledge, at the moment in Massachusetts, clubs can't serve on premises. I think I did a little work. As of Saturday, 39 of the 50 states, in addition to the national state of emergency, 39 of the 50 states have declared a state of emergency. So I'd say in those states, it's probably where you're going to see the more aggressive, slowdowns. The poll that we did at the outset of the webinar, which 1,029 respondents responded to. And by the way, I'll say there's well over 2,000. There's almost 2,200 people on this webinar, which is amazing. But in that, the question that Henry had asked followed on to the survey from the weekend. I think this is really good contextual data. How much is it affecting operations at your club? There were 4 buckets. A lot, moderate, we're closed, or very little and none. 10% of the respondents said very little to none. 47% said it's affecting us in a moderate way. 17% said they've closed the club as of now. And 26% said it's affecting us in a significant or a lot, meaning a la carte restricted or gone and banquets for the short term gone. There's different types of revenues, as we all know, in clubs. and they have different impacts on the financial outcome. So if you look at the two segments of the industry, clubs with golf and clubs without golf, clubs with golf has a dues to revenue ratio of 50% at the median. At the 25th percentile, it's 45%. So the clubs that are in the lower quartile, there are about a quarter of the clubs in the country that have what we would characterize as a fees and ancillary revenue centric model. So they're relying on banquet revenue, golf outings, or their members paying for their services more through fees than from dues. The 75th percentile is 56%, so a quarter of the clubs have a ratio over 56. They have a more dues-centric financial model. We've often referred to the fee-based financial model, or the lower dues, as a higher risk operating model. And this is an example of where that comes into play. I think Rahm Emanuel said during the financial crisis, no crisis is too good an opportunity to waste. So in terms of just thinking strategically over time, this is an example of why clubs should lean away from that fee-based model and more towards the dues-based model. Obviously, the clubs with higher dues to revenue ratios will have a less significant impact operationally from an operational finance standpoint. I'll address capital in a minute. Clubs that have a fees or outside revenue-based model will definitely be affected more. What we've seen or heard is in the short term, the clubs I've heard from since, I'll say, Thursday, I would say generally speaking, in the 39 states that have a state of emergency, and as Frank said, there will be some regional variation, but I would say generally speaking, banquet revenue through the end of April is going to be under pressure immediately. We all know, and probably everyone involved in a club has seen cancellations or postponements. So that's definitely going to take a hit. The good news is for the median club or the average club, while it has an effect, it doesn't have a profound impact in the short term. The golf outing revenue, I've heard of clubs that are, especially ones that are more in the center of the country, we can have outings a little earlier, tend to be in the northern half of the country. The outings don't start in earnest until May, some in April, but there's definitely outing revenue that will get impacted. That will have more of an impact. Outing revenue is, quote unquote, a higher gross profit for the greens fees than banquet revenue. So that would potentially have more of an impact, but there's less of it. And then it depends on the state and where you fall on the operations spectrum. But let's say, probably when it's all said and done, I'm going to guess 25 to 40% of clubs suspend a la carte dining for some period of time. That shouldn't have too much of a financial impact on the club. It depends on how you're going to handle the staff. If clubs do what businesses seem to be leaning to doing, and I think clubs, probably given the kind of the time of the season, certainly in the northern three quarters of the country where things are just about to pick up, my sense is that the club's going to have to figure out how to continue to pay the staff to keep the staff. So depending on where you fall on the spectrum of paying the staff, especially the F&B staff, which is about 40% of the overall labor in the average club, the two departments that make up most of the labor in the average club with golf is food and beverage and golf course maintenance. Those two departments account for about 70% of the overall labor expense. So depending on how you handle the staff and paying the staff or not paying the staff, obviously will have the major impact ultimately on where you end up financially in the short term. In the longer term, let's say midsummer and after, the real question, which no one on this town hall could answer, the questions will become, will the country slide into a recession? What will the stock market do? I personally believe that in terms of what really drives clubs, which is the members members intake, member retention, members joining. That'll be impacted much more by the stock market than it will be by the short-term mitigation effects to try and arrest the spread of the disease. So the short-term mitigation effects are going to affect non-dues revenue. The longer-term effect that we'd be concerned with in the industry is the dues revenue and the capital income. And I think that's going to be tied much more to the what happens with the stock market. On the capital ledger, this is the good news and why clubs really need to kind of get their capital house in order. But, capital dues, recurring capital dues, debt service fees, those things are going to hum along for the most part. Some clubs might lose some marginal members, or lose a member on the margin in the short term, but I think that's going to take longer to play out. And then what'll take even, in that midterm to longer term is the initiation fee income. If it has an impact into the season when we bring in the prospective members, the April, May, early June timeframe when they're coming in shopping the club, if we're still reeling with the crisis, that could have an impact, obviously, on intake of new members. And then I think in the longer term, what the industry will see is, depending on the stock market's rebound or lack thereof, projects that clubs have been centered on, capital investment projects, that's not something we could predict. We just have to take it as it comes. But if there's a long-term effect, we might see some of that. So for my mind, the short term through the end of April, there's no question that clubs are going to see some kind of downside in terms of their non-dues revenue, but I would suggest that's a marginal bottom line impact. I think in the midterm to longer term, we'll have to see the effects on dues revenue and then on initiation fee income. In my mind, the wild card there is the stock market and how long that takes to recover. And then just for the sake of completing the analysis, but 20% of the clubs in the country don't have golf. Really, the main characterization of the financial difference between clubs with golf and clubs without golf is dues revenue. Clubs without golf have lower dues ratios than clubs with golf. The median for clubs without golf is around 38 to 40%. Versus 50% in clubs with golf. So there's a chance, by definition, if the dues ratio is lower, clubs without golf tend to lean a bit more heavily on services and ancillary fees, by definition. So there's a chance as a whole, the clubs without golf, which is mainly comprised of yacht clubs and city athletic clubs, will see a bit more of a detrimental impact in the short term than clubs with golf. They don't have the option, the main amenity, I suppose, in clubs with golf is golf, and it seems like a number of clubs will keep the golf course open. Clubs without golf, it's more communal, it's more inside. So I'd suggest they're probably going to see a little bit more on the margin impact. And then one thing I'll say, and I'm not trying to be an opportunist, but on the other hand, it's important. There's a whole bunch of people in the industry on this webinar now. Club benchmarking offered a year ago to the industry in a limited manner. We just opened it up broadly or 2 weeks ago, I guess. What we call a strategic monthly dashboard. It's a free service for the industry, and the intent of it is not that we could have seen this coming, but the intent is so that the clubs. In the last economic meltdown, clubs made very poor decisions because they didn't have real-time information on their market. So if the market as a whole is declining rapidly and people aren't joining, it probably doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to cut the initiation fee if it's a broad downturn. But a lot of clubs did that, and it didn't help. It makes things worse. So the strategic monthly dashboard allows clubs, all we have to do is participate in it, and it gives clubs in near real time every month a quantification of what's going on in the market at large, nationally, or in their local market through peer groups. And you can see how many members are entering or exiting the club, and what initiation fees are doing, and what the cost of belonging is doing. every month. We created this service as an industry service for free for exactly, I could never have seen this coming, but we envisioned a recession coming, and we need better data to make better decisions, and we need to understand what the heck's going on in the overall market. This is the way to see that. One of the metrics that we collect is non-dues revenue, and we collect it for a year-over-year period. So you can actually see what happened to non-dues revenue in, let's say, March of 2020 versus March of 2019. We'll be able to see it for the industry at large. So I think, we did a webinar 2 weeks ago on this, and I had put this statement in, the market can change abruptly and quickly. We didn't see it 2 weeks ago. I don't think anyone did, but here we are. So this is a way for clubs to have data that allows them to characterize accurately the market and the dynamic changes that are occurring in real time in the market. So there's a whole bunch of clubs on this webinar. The more that participate, the more the industry has mission critical insight to help make better decisions. So it's a bit of a plug, but we hope people will participate, especially at this juncture. And that's what I have for right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. And moving on quickly to Mitch Boyarsky, who is a partner with Nelson Mullins. His firm, Mr. Boyarsky, focuses practice on labor and employment issues. So I'll turn it over to you, Mitch.
Thank you. I thank the NCA for asking me to speak to you about coronavirus workplace implications. I'm an employment lawyer, partner at Nelson Mullins, and I've represented employers for 25 years. A significant part of my practice is counseling employers on various workplace issues, doing litigation avoidance through counseling, development of policies and procedures, and workplace compliance initiatives. I am very sympathetic for the difficulties and challenges you are facing. I wish I were giving a presentation on trade secrets protection or sex harassment and discrimination, but we're dealing with the new reality, and the goal of which is to make this temporary. If you have already been inundated with information and recommendations about how to manage your workforces before today's webinar, you're not alone. I'm going to today focus on the workplace preparedness. And keep in mind, as Joe had mentioned before, the government is working on legislation as we speak. You need to focus and keep in mind directives and programs from the local, state, and federal government, which are in a state of flux. So I'm going to cover the current state of the law, but we also need to be mindful as proposed legislation comes out, what to anticipate. In 15 minutes, I can't do a very deep dive. Therefore, if there's any questions, I am happy to speak to anyone offline. You can also contact my partner, Michelle Tanzer, who is the chair of our global club and branded residences practice. So I'm going to start focusing on the slides. If possible, to give me a little bit of assistance so that we can jump back into my presentation, that'd be great. You already know and probably have told your employees to thoroughly wash your hands with soap, avoid the sick, practice social distancing, increase your janitorial services and hygiene in your clubs. But now is also the time to brush up on your employee handbooks and policies, particularly related to leave management, absenteeism, benefits coverage, and employee safety. And I know several speakers have gone through that already, so I'll try to be brief and avoid some duplication. It's also necessary to disseminate a communication to your members about what you're doing and if you are modifying your services the way that you will operate going forward for the near future at least. Then you need to train your staff on the new measures and the protocol in light of these safety initiatives. For example, if you're a country club with golf facilities, you must consider restrictions for the number of employees in the pro shop, the number of people in the pro shop, closing or limiting access, social distancing in locker rooms and in social areas in the club. For caddies, you might consider having them wear latex gloves and instructing them to avoid touching the grips on the golf clubs. In conjunction with the instructions to caddies and other staff, consider a communication to your members so that they anticipate and understand these changes. By communicating these types of precautions and preventive measures, you can help to continue your operations with less concern and disruption, assuming your decision is to continue operations or not to postpone events. One of the more common questions I received over the last few weeks, including last night, by the way, is what are the rules for employee leaves of absence, both paid and unpaid? Well, first, you need to consider what is the reason for leave. Is it voluntary quarantine or due to sickness of the employee or family member of the employee? If you have time off for your club under your policy or handbook, an employee might be entitled to paid time for quarantine or for sickness. However, sick time under various state laws is not for voluntary quarantine. It's not even for mandatory quarantine. So these are, some things that you need to decide. Perhaps you might make an exception, or you might interpret your paid time off policy to cover the scenario. But remember, if you make exceptions and changes your rules, then those could be somewhat binding on future situations. If the time is for sickness of the employee or to care for a sick family member, a company sick leave policy should apply, but you need to confirm that according to your handbooks. Maybe now is the time to tweak them for this type of use. Also, if you're in a state that does not provide for paid sick leave and the employee does not have any more paid time, then you need to decide if the Family Medical Leave Act applies. Now, I'm talking about the FMLA that currently exists, not the new legislation, but that could change things. Do you have 50 or more employees that triggers FMLA coverage? In the coronavirus scenario, FMLA applies for employees with a serious health condition or to care for an immediate family member with a serious health condition, but it doesn't provide for simply quarantine. So an employee's eligibility does depend upon the reason. Maybe you don't provide for paid time off for quarantine, and until the new bill becomes law, you need to consider whether to pay an employee while on a leave due to quarantine or the closing of an operation. Question, can employees work remotely? Well, this is a difficult question to tackle. Perhaps for marketing and events coordinators, that might work. But for F&B departments, they don't lend themselves to telecommuting for the obvious reasons. As you likely anticipated, employee privacy issues come into play. What do you do if an employee reports that he or she came into contact with a person who traveled from a high-risk country or resides with a person who returned from such a country? Let's just say that you decide the employee should quarantine. Can you tell the employee's coworkers? Well, generally the answer is yes, but you also need to manage the coworkers' expectations and to communicate in a way that doesn't cause panic. Remember, we don't even know if this visitor has the virus. There's a good reason that person may not have it. We don't even know if the employee has the virus. So you need to communicate in a managed way to avoid hysteria. You could tell the employees that out of an abundance of caution, this employee is staying home and that you should take time off for a few days. This, a communication to the others that are not quarantined. Or maybe you just alert the staff that a person is self-quarantining. But I would suggest that you need to consider these things on a case-by-case scenario. You shouldn't discuss an employee's medical condition with coworkers because that employee is entitled to certain privacy under the HIPAA, which is the federal privacy law for the protection of protected health information, or PHI. I have been asked whether it's okay to take an employee's temperature. And you have to keep in mind that if employees know that you take their temperature, they might take pain relievers to mask a fever. However, if you decide you want to do it, there could be some state biometric law that comes into place. So you need to consider in what state you operate. At the very least, I would suggest that you need employee consent. Second, there is some EEOC guidance suggesting that it might be okay, but also mandatory medical tests on employees are unlawful unless they are job-related and consistent with business necessity, or there's a direct threat of safety to the employees. So it's not completely clear under federal law, but if it's limited and it's consensual, it's probably okay. So you need to still consider state law. When making decisions affecting employees, you need to decide without regard to race and national origin. It could potentially be discriminatory if you tell someone who is Chinese or Italian to quantify simply based upon that person's national origin. And while the news may be mesmerizing and there's political pundits who are having a field day, be sure to consult government websites and to rely upon science and professionals for guidance. Someone sent me a result of an employee survey that was done nationally very recently, and it was interesting that the results of the survey said essentially that employees rely upon the credibility of the information from their employers more than they do social media and sometimes the government. So it's important to have a plan with a task force that is monitoring the situation and can make some decisive choices. You don't want to react with knee-jerk responses. Instead, I suggest that you respond effectively. So if you don't already have legal counsel, I would consider one. Other professionals, especially those on the call, including financial and employee safety and health, are the key. The mere fact also that you have a task force and that you can tell members and staff that you have one will build confidence in your club's leadership and your employees. Under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, an employer has a general obligation to safeguard the work environment and the employees of the workplace. And that means taking precautions and instituting cleanliness standards and modifying them in heightened situations. And I would suggest that COVID-19 is one of them. So the more you do now, the better your clubs will be later. For those who remain open, social distancing should be your regular protocol. The CDC has defined social distancing, and that may change, but keep focus on the CDC website for assistance and additional guidance. For your staff who wear uniforms, review your uniform policies and provide additional laundry service. I would prefer not to have employees launder their own uniforms, and better that you do it. I talked about caddies before. If you have staff assisting in other recreational and sports activities, decide what etiquette they will use and inform members who are then prepared for those changes so that they're not surprised. If you remain open and need temporary staffing, you might consider contingency plans such as third parties. If you have reduced staffing, well, maybe you're okay with your current workforce situation. For those members on boards and committees, consult with them. However, remember that you as the owner and operator or manager of your club are the employer, and that the members serving on those committees, while laudable and very, very helpful, aren't ultimately going to be liable or sued if an employee makes a claim. So you need to use outside professionals, get appropriate advice, and make decisions that you're ultimately going to live with. I tried to put together some questions, more common questions that I have received in this context, and so that would be helpful, and then obviously we have questions and answers later. But if an employee tests positive for coronavirus, can the club inquire with the employee about the exposure? What should the club say to other employees, and what should the club say to its members? The first, I think, response is based upon your privacy policies and your personnel practices. You can ask if the employee traveled abroad. You can ask if the employee resides with someone who traveled abroad or returned from another country. And you can try to figure out if the employee contracted it from a member. But you just need to be careful about medical inquiries. For example, you can't ask the person if he or she has some sort of disease or condition that compromises their immune system. You can't ask if the person has a genetic predisposition to sickness. So you can ask generally about exposure, or you can ask if someone tested positive. Second question, does the club have to pay employees if it shuts down? The answer is no, but keep in mind there's the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. The acronym is WARN. Some states have mini WARN acts, so that law triggers a notice obligation of 60 days in the event of a mass layoff or plant closing. A temporary shutdown or furlough is likely not going to be a plant closing or mass layoff under WARN, but you need to be mindful. You're going to be covered by WARN if you have at least 100 employees, but for the most part, I don't think this is going to be a WARN event, again, unless there is a permanent shutdown or a mass layoff that lasts at least 6 months. So the rules are a little bit tricky, and if anyone is considering any more long-lasting shutdowns, I recommend that you speak with counsel. What happens if an employee refuses to come to work because they are afraid of an exposure to the virus? Well, an employee can refuse to work, and of course, an employer could treat that as a refusal to cooperate or work, but I would suggest that you need to be careful about how you might consider job abandonment and the best way to handle it. So if an employee is refusing to work, claiming a health and safety violation, that person could actually be protected under OSHA, and you have to think about potential whistleblower retaliation claims. So I would try to be mindful, compassionate, and work with the employee under those circumstances. Of course, you may have already dealt with this by an across-the-board practice or communication with your employees. Consider communicating with your employees and taking a humane approach to attendance, I think is really the sort of the bottom line. The next question, and again, these are real examples. I know other employers have implemented taking temperatures, but can a club require that an employee take his or her temperature? As I suggested before, you need to be careful, especially if the employee refuses. In that case, I wouldn't demand it. I've also heard that there's some technology that now can read an employee's body temperature. Again, be mindful of state biometric laws. If you're doing something involuntarily and without employee consent, you could trip up those state laws. Fifth question, does an employee have an obligation to inform the club of an exposure? Again, we're assuming that the employee tests positive or has a confirmed reason to disclose this. And I do think in that situation, you need to consider informing members. It's not worth the risk that a member finds out secondhand. And keep in mind that the employee who tested positive does have certain HIPAA protections against the disclosure of protected health information. So you need to be mindful of those HIPAA and privacy compliance obligations. So I know that there's a lot more material to cover. There's been some discussion about the proposed legislation. I think it's important to be mindful of that. Just one or two things about the proposed legislation, which is that the employer or the clubs in your case would pay first, and then you can apply for the tax credit. There's some ambiguity about how the employee would notify the club that he or she is taking the emergency FMLA leave, and I suspect that we will get from the government, probably the DOL, some more information and rulemaking, especially about the notice opportunity and the notice obligations. And then there's going to be a whole host of record keeping that goes with how we manage emergency FMLA, just like we do regular FMLA. So a lot, I think, to consider for the future, in the very near future with proposed legislation, and think about your policies and best practices. And someone had already said communication is key. do it effectively, and try to do it in a way that's meaningful, but also in a way that avoids creating additional concern. So that's what I have. Happy to jump on the questions with everyone at the end.
Thank you, Mitch. Greatly appreciate that. And that concludes the sort of prepared material that we had planned on putting together for everybody. I would just want to mention real quickly that since we've been on the call, the states of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut have announced that restaurants and bars will be closing at 8 o'clock tonight. And also the state of Maryland, bars and restaurants will be closing at 5 o'clock today. There's also continued discussion about potentially shutting down some domestic air travel, particularly for areas that have a hotspot, a number of infections. So obviously this is changing almost, I wouldn't say hourly, it's almost by the minute. Things are changing. And that certainly drives quite a bit of the questions that we have around these issues. So I guess I want to throw this to Dr. Troisi. So 17% of the clubs that are on this call have already said that they're closing. And I think one of the biggest questions people have, managers and folks who are engaged in the club industry have on this call is, should they be shutting down? Should they wait for the state government or local public health officials to tell them that they need to shut down, or what's the best approach here?
That's a really hard question. Obviously, if your local or state jurisdiction requests or mandates that you shut down, then you should follow, or if it's mandatory, you have to, that guidance. It's going to be dependent on your situation. And, can you institute enough social distancing or physical distancing and to prevent spread? Can you not have big groups? As I should have mentioned this, but CDC just last night recommended that meetings or groups of 50 or more not take place. If you're outside and you're just playing golf and you can maintain that distance, it's probably okay. You also want to be cognizant of your people or clients who may be at higher risk. And that's a lot of people. As I said, 40% of Americans have a comorbid condition, and then there are those of us over age 60. But there are economic considerations, as you know, and so I just don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. Sorry.
No, I think that's a perfectly appropriate answer, and no need for apologies. And it is something that I think, depending on where you are in the country and what your local officials are telling you, and what the prevalence of the virus is in your area, is going to really determine that. So, Ray, one of the questions that's come up is really, how do clubs, how are they planning to manage the cash flow issues over the next few months if this gets, beyond mid-April or beginning of May?
Well,
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think it goes back to which type of club are you? Are you a more dues-centric club or a non-dues-centric club? I think that if you're non-dues-centric, tend to going to have more of an impact, because the clubs that are dues-centric will continue, I would assume, to bill dues. I did see in the questions from the survey that some folks asked, should we continue billing dues during this crisis? And I would say the answer to that is 100% yes. I don't think any member would expect that their dues would be, negated during the crisis. in terms of the minimum spend for F&B, that's another question entirely. I mean, it might be logical to suspend that if this, first, that short-term period I talked about goes beyond April. That might be something to do. I think the clubs that the median club, just to get one metric out that could help maybe with this, the median club, if you look at the total cash, and I mean total cash, even if you have cash reserves for capital, but if you take the whole industry and take the median club has cash on hand, which would be cash or investments, liquid money, that's equal, it equates to 15% of the operating revenue. So over a 12-month period, you're at about roughly 8% per month. So that says the median club has 2 months worth of cash on hand as it relates to the operating revenue of the business, which isn't a large stockpile. I think we would all agree. So it could be, if this thing lasts more than a couple of months, it's going to have an impact on cash flow. I mean, I think that if you have an operating line of credit, which many clubs do, it's a buffer. And I think that the next question really becomes, and it goes back to Joe, to the government's response, but what will clubs do as regards paying their labor, the staff? So the median payroll to revenue ratio is 55 or 6% across the industry. So over half the expenses are labor. And it, really depends on, I think, ultimately what clubs decide in terms of paying their staff if they're in one of the modes where they're, severely reducing operations. So, in summary, if you're in a club where your operating revenue to cash, let's say, cash to operating revenue is, let's say, well below 10%, those are the clubs that are going to have more issue in the short term, clearly. 15% is the median for the industry. Everyone can do this calculation very quickly for themselves. And then I think, do you have an operating line of credit? And if so, that'll become a buffer. And then it's just a matter of, what you're going to do with your labor pool in terms of pay and not pay.
Sure. And that's, you raised the federal legislation, and I think one of the things that we're seeing here in terms of what a shortcoming might be with the legislation, as well-intentioned as it is, it really it gets at folks who are either have been diagnosed with the coronavirus or are caring for a family member or a child who's no longer in school or in daycare. But the big hole here is how does the club manage in terms of their staff and taking care of them financially if they're forced to close down. There are more options for individuals who, have been diagnosed with the disease or, all of those different categories. But there's the gray area here is if the club just goes ahead and shuts down, how do they, manage those issues? So, and I think that that's kind of the next step in terms of what we talked about in the federal legislation efforts is, that economic injury that this public health crisis is causing. There's going to be legislation in the coming days and weeks to address some of those issues. There was a statement put out by airline industry group that basically estimated because of the slowdown and potential for domestic travel restrictions, they could see some airlines going bankrupt by May. So that kind of brings into focus how big this public health crisis is in terms of the impact on the economy. And as I talked about in the beginning of the call, there are some resources that are available through the Small Business Administration due to the declaration of a national emergency. I've been in contact with some folks at the Small Business Administration to try to make sure that we get the information we can and filter that out to our members. So with that, I want to switch over to Frank Vane and ask you, where most clubs right now are really entering peak membership recruitment season. And as we all know, clubs tend to have a natural attrition rate, and that can vary by club. But and then we have all of the golf events. The Players Championship obviously was shut down after the first round. The Masters is being postponed, potentially canceled. And those are really kind of big events within the golf industry specifically that kind of get people jazzed up who aren't members of a private club yet to go out and start looking at those clubs. What are you seeing in terms of membership recruitment and sort of the long-term health that's being affected by this short-term crisis?
Well, Joe, really, too early to tell. As you say, we are on the cusp of that for many of us, and as we all know, things were chugging along pretty good a month or so ago, and there was a lot of optimism there, consumer optimism, obviously at record levels. Duration is going to be key. I just looked at something. Scott Gottlieb, who seems to be one of the leading medical authorities on this, says the peak is mid-April to early May. So that level of uncertainty is going to have a dampening effect. There's no other way to view it, I think, at this point, and I agree with Ray. I've been saying that until the public health crisis even reached a higher level. The stock market is really number one threat to private clubs is to upsetting the assets of reducing the assets of those who are most likely to join a club. So. I don't know that there's an easy answer to your question at this point in time. This is coming at a difficult time, as you say, for wedding season for many of our clubs. I say the kickoff to the golf season for many of us, and our records have consistently shown a high majority of joining, 2/3 of joining, really between sort of April 1st and June, as the typical time period. So it's really going to be a sense of whether we get a hold on this, financial markets stabilize, and if we can get a sense that health administration and activities that we're doing are going to work. And I think it's just literally, if not week by week, almost a day by day situation that restores some level of confidence to people. And I think we're just going to have to frankly wait and see.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Troisi, I want to come back to you. As I mentioned at the outset of the call, I've been working in Washington in various capacities for 25 years, and the first 20 years I spent actually doing healthcare policy. And this is, I think, by far one of the, if not the most urgent public health crisis I've seen, certainly in 20, 30 years. So we're really, there's a lot of known knowns, there's a lot of, known unknowns and unknown unknowns that we're wrestling with here. But could you give us a sense of, without necessarily getting into the recriminations of the tests and who's at fault and who may not be at fault and all that kind of stuff, but can you give us a clearer picture yet on exactly, where the testing is, right now, and how we sort of ramp that up?
Yeah, so I am simply stating a fact that the administration chose not to use the WHO kits that the rest of the world is using, and that's why other countries are able to test a lot more people than we have. A kit was developed by CDC, but when it was shipped out to state public health laboratories, it was found that one of the components was not working correctly. So those kits had to be sent back. So we basically had no testing for a while. The problem has been ramping up production of these kits. However, starting it could have been, it might be today, I'm not sure. It could have been late last week. Both LabCorp and Quest are providing testing with a different test that they have. I don't think they've developed it, but they've they are utilizing it. They've gotten permission to use it. So that should increase the amount of testing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. And just to kind of follow on to that, and sort of recognizing that we're entering a new phase where we're going to start identifying new cases at I suspect, a fairly rapid rate. And that's going to, drive some decisions in terms of, closures and what the public health system, how it's going to react. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, yes, we're going to see a lot more cases. Again, not that they are necessarily new. They've been there. You can't find what you don't test for. But the upside of that is that we will be able to know quicker whether someone's infected, and so do they, or whether they are infected or were exposed to, somebody who might have been exposed to someone who we now know was not infected. So we will not have to quarantine as many people, and we'll be able to find out better where the virus is in a community, so we can make those decisions based on, evidence rather than just guesses.
Mm-hmm. So taking that next step in terms of we start to identify more people who are, who have been diagnosed or may have been exposed to people who have diagnosed. Mitch, you had mentioned kind of got into the membership notification and staff notification issues, and certainly, I know that clubs want to make sure that they're not in violation of the Health Information Protection Patient Protection Act, or HIPAA, but clubs, the staff, the members, oftentimes, these are people who are, they know each other, and they know each other very well, and over time, almost become an extension of family. It gets to be that close, particularly with employees who are longtime members of the club and longtime members of the club. I guess my question is, if the club is notified that a member has been infected or has been exposed to somebody who's been affected, how should we communicate that to the membership and to the staff while still being respectful and following HIPAA? Because like I said, these are very tight-knit communities, and chances are somebody's going to know, and that's going to sort of move its way through the membership, as it were. So how do we manage those issues?
Yes, the HIPAA law is going to protect our employees. It's not going to establish a confidentiality or privacy protection for the members necessarily, unless they're also employed. So under that statute, we'd be mindful of what we shared with members regarding an employee exposure, where it's the other way around, putting aside the business ramifications of informing employees of a membership exposure. There's really no legal prohibitions except, I think, business judgment. So you want to balance the employee's need and your employer needs to protect employees, providing a safe and healthy work environment. And so I think it's kind of a managed communication where you would tell an employee that you've been notified that there was a reported case. We can't disclose more information, but given that circumstance, we are taking the following appropriate measures. And then you're specific about those. I would do that in writing so that there's a record of the employer having given the employees notice, and then say at the same time, we have to respect the privacy of our members as well. So we'll give you as much information as we are permitted to do, but not overstate it. And in this way, if you do it in a controlled way, you communicate in writing, you avoid the rumor mill or help to avoid the rumor mill, and you do it in a way that there is a more, I think, respected way to do the protections for your employees and your members.
So appreciate that, Mitch. Just if you could briefly walk me through or walk us through, a potential example. So let's say you have a member who's notified the club that he or she has been diagnosed. Is that member's name given to the staff so that they can determine potential exposures, or what's the information flow there?
Right. Again, because there's no legal prohibition against disclosing the member's name under HIPAA, we don't owe that obligation to the member. You could. I think you also need to think about, what's appropriate in your situation. Perhaps you can identify which employees that member came into contact with. You might give those employees, if they were working that day when that member showed up, perhaps more information. At the very least, you're going to say to the employees that there was, a definite notification, and that we're taking preventive measures. And also, I think at the same time you're going to do that communication, you will have already decided, right, or we're going to impose a quarantine on those individuals. So to avoid, tons of follow-up questions and uncertainty after that, I would be prepared with the task force to decide what you're going to do, if you're going to impose quarantine or not, if you're just going to expand social distancing in the club or something else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I guess one of the additional approaches that you could take is if a member notifies the club that they have been infected or have been exposed, somebody within the management of the club could have a conversation with that member to determine who they, recall interacting with on the staff, and you could maybe handle it that way, or is it better just to have a blanket, sort of communication to the employees?
It's appropriate to call the member and to get some more information and confirmation, and also tell the member that you're going to do things in a way, to try to manage the flow of information, but, we need to protect our employees. You also may decide to shut down the operations, at least temporarily, to do some additional cleaning, clean surfaces, right? Decide, where, in fact, that member may have been and focus on those especially. So, you could do a lot more, direct and forceful way to deal with the exposure. For the clubs that are, trying to remain open, I think the first is to speak with the member and get information and decide amongst your task force, with counsel, how you're going to handle that notification to the employees. And then clearly you're going to tell the member that the member and, their families who they reside with should not come to the club for a certain period of time, likely 2 weeks to get past the incubation period.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I think we have arrived at the 1 o'clock hour. And I do want to say that there's obviously a lot more questions, and what we're going to do is collect those questions, and to the best extent we can, we're going to try to get responses out to those who registered for this webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my CEO, Henry Wallmeyer. Henry?
Great. Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you to the more than 2,400 people who participated in today's webinar. As Joe said, we just had way too many questions to answer during this, but what we're going to do is we're going to continue to provide you information, one through our coronavirus microsite, nationalclub.org/coronavirus. But we're going to be sending all participants in today's webinar a resource, basically our coronavirus update newsletter. We'll be sending that out to you. That will have the Q&A from today, as well as questions that we didn't get to during the webinar. That will also have the survey results from the survey that we sent out over the weekend, as well as the one that we had right here at the beginning of the call. And we'll also continue to have town halls and continue to do this on a very regular basis as things are changing changing, by the hour, as we saw with Joe mentioning the states that are closing, and someone sent in that also Michigan has now closed their bars and restaurants as well. So we will continue to provide you with as much information as we can so that your club can make the best decision for itself. And if there's any questions or there's anything that we can do, don't hesitate to reach out to us here at the office or through our website. But look for more information from us regarding this. So again, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you especially to all the presenters who did this. And we look forward to touch base with you momentarily. Thank you so much. Have a great day.